Hi, Alan. Welcome to Mastery Effect podcast series. Poorani and I have been really looking forward to this interview, and we thought that we can start off by having you introduce yourself.
Sure. First, it's an honor to be here, and thanks for inviting me, Ramesh and Poorani. So, Alan AtKisson is my name. I live in Stockholm, Sweden. Maybe the most important thing to say about me in a professional context is that I've been at the game of sustainability work and systems changes and sustainable development for a long time. Been able to watch it evolve over many different phases, and I've been with it not from the absolute beginning, but certainly from maybe just a year after the UN minted it and started off as a consultant with a little shop. And I did that for a long time. I grew the business. And then at a certain point, I realized that rather than influencing decision makers, maybe it was time to be one. And I secured a position in the Swedish government and worked in the international arena for quite a number of years. And now I'm writing books again. I've written a lot of books over the years, Ramesh, and you've done a lot of things too. But now I have the luxury of just doing that full time.
Wow.
That's lovely.
It's a great honor to be interacting with you. Poorani often quotes you. In our program, we use the sustainability definition, the ongoing thriving of a living system. Can you share about that whole thinking that you were working on so many years ago?
Well, thanks. I always begin by talking about who my teachers were and my mentors, because that's the only reason I'm here talking with you. And there are too many to mention, so I usually just focus on the one who was most centrally important to me in my professional life and significant during my personal life as well, because these things get wrapped up together, as I know you both know. And that was Donella Meadows, who was the lead author of the book, The Limits to Growth, back in 1972. An unusual thing to be the lead author of such an important global best-selling technical mind-bending book in 1972. It was more often the case that the male co-authors would get all the attention, and the woman who actually wrote the text would be somewhere in the background. But she was a forerunner in many ways, including that way, and was just an extraordinary individual. I'd read her book in 1979 as a college student, and it just was one of those books that infects you deeply. It's systems thinking, it's sustainability, it's change work. And then I had the opportunity of getting to know her. And I could just say the rest is history, because getting to know her was the turning point in my professional life. And I'm happy to say more about that later. I became passionately committed to not just sustainability as a concept, but sustainability as a practice. And also with the whole notion that this, at that time, marginal, somewhat radical, and totally unknown idea should become mainstream. And of course, here we are. And there are sustainable development goals in the United Nations and companies and investors. That's a long time. It took decades.
Wow, that's just awesome.
You did write about optimism in the world of pessimism around that. And now, so many years later, what would you say about that optimism or pessimism today?
I was afraid you were going to ask that question, Poorani. I am writing the third book in a trilogy now that I started in the 90s. And the trilogy got named by my publisher at the time, the Optimist Trilogy. So somehow I have to maintain an optimistic framing, even in this third book. And of course, to be perfectly honest, that's both a lot harder and a lot easier today. One of the things that allows us to sustain some optimism is we can look back on several decades of really remarkable progress in this space. As I said, going from radical marginal idea that nobody but some UN diplomats and a few scientists had ever heard about practically, to a concept that is widely embraced in every major continental region of the world, shall we say, more or less. It has ups and downs and backsliding and all the rest of it, but it is widely accepted now. That's a real plus, and we can lean on that to sustain our optimism, that despite that things also had backsliding moments a decade ago or 2 decades ago, and then regained their momentum. So it just takes time. The harder part is the reality of where we are today and how much there is still to do to make the dream of a sustainable world. And by saying dream, I mean inspiration. When I say sustainable, I mean scientific measurement. But to make the dream of a sustainable world real, we've got to do a whole lot of things really quickly. And one of the new things we have to do is deal with the damage that we have dialed ourselves into. So we're going to have to both deal with the damage, deal with both the people and the natural systems that are suffering from climate change, from habitat loss, from various kinds of inequality, while we continue the task of deep, dramatic, systemic transformation. I think we can do it, or I wouldn't be bothering to write a book or talk with you. But I do want to be very honest about the fact that we're not getting out of this easy, and we're not getting out of this with a certain amount of significant pain and loss.
Well, that's a very hopeful peek at the future. If I can just extend this a little bit further from the threat of AI, which is another dimension to sustainability and the damage. Do you see that as maybe a black swan effect? Could that maybe tip things?
Oh, I think it is tipping things already. Another hero of mine, whom I never had the pleasure of meeting, but whose work I admired deeply, was James Lovelock, who, together with Lynn Margulis, first framed the Gaia hypothesis, this idea that the Earth's systems, in a very interesting, complicated, intricate way, work together to help sustain the conditions for life. Now, that's a long story in itself. We might even return to it because it's something that I'm focusing a lot on in my new book. But the thing I wanted to refer to was James Lovelock's last book. He passed away at the age of 102 or 3. And when he was 100, he published a new book some years ago now called Novocene. We've talked about the Anthropocene and we live in the Holocene. He said this is the Novocene, because it's just something so new we really can't get our heads around. How about this, to be 100 years old and write a controversial book? I have that as a goal myself now.
Right.
His idea was that we're not solve the climate crisis without the help of AI.
Oh.
Yeah. And this was an early idea. This was before all the stuff that we're hearing now about the risks and the energy consumption, the issues around AI that we talk about. This was one of the co-founders of the Gaia hypothesis, saying humanity really is going to have to partner up with these technologies we're creating because the situation is so complicated and difficult that we need to do that. Can it tip the scales? I don't know. It might tip them the other way because it'll consume all of our resources. I don't know. But I find it interesting. I'm going to avoid saying hopeful because I don't know yet, but I find it very interesting, and I'm trying to understand myself about what's happening as much as I can.
Oh, wow.
I think it makes sense. It is a paradox, right? That thinking or generative skill of AI at the same time, at what price, what expense? Can we afford it? So I think the jury is still out, but we'll know soon enough at the rate it's going, right?
I think you're right. The
That's
black
true.
swan will show up any minute.
I think so. Yeah. I want to circle back to the earlier point that you made, that you started to look at sustainability as a practice. I wonder whether that meant like start off with shifting the mindset. That's an area that we are particularly interested in, and we focus very much on that. And can you share a little bit more about that piece?
Sure. This is the mastery effect. That's the name of your podcast. And it's linked to the whole tradition of Society for Organizational Learning and Peter Senge's work, and all of that coming out of the same intellectual crucible, to use your word, as Danila Meadows and Grove. They were all studying and working together in MIT back in the day. The idea of sustainability being a mindset, I would almost say it needs to be the mindset. And it absolutely, it's the reason to take a deep dive into all of these issues. Because it's a planetary imperative now to work towards it. And it turns out that systems thinking and personal mastery and collaborative facilitative processes, stakeholder engagement, all these things are part of the unavoidable recipe for how to get there. Now, then they show up in different ways in different cultures. We may have new black swan effects from AI and this and that, but we don't get there without that mindset. So I've been working a long time on how do you get that mindset more accessible. Many years ago, I had a little aha moment because we were working on sustainability indicators in a very technical way. And we were looking at the framing of a very well-known ecological economist around that time, Herman Daly, who said, hey, there's nature, and nature creates the stuff that we make economies out of. And then the economy makes a society possible. And if you have a good society, you have healthy individuals. That was his pyramid of how sustainability should be thought about. And I thought, well, that's really nice, but most people don't think that way. And also, it's a little more complicated. And somebody in the room said, we need a better compass for sustainability. And then suddenly I went, oh my gosh, a compass. North, east, south, west, nature, economy, society, well-being. And I ran up to the whiteboard and I drew this picture. And that was 97 or something. And now there's a global NGO called Compass Education. And the idea there was just, how do you make the mindset of sustainability and systems thinking more accessible to people of all ages everywhere? And that little symbol, the compass, is used for their annual reports on sustainability, or companies working in the outdoor arena, like the compass mountain metaphor. So I'm very happy that a lot of people are still working on that. I have no formal role with Compass Education, for example. It's an NGO that's run by people that I gifted my intellectual property to, but they're doing a great job, and I'm a big cheerleader. But I'm still working on new ways to get that mindset a little deeper into the culture.
I just wanted to share, as a matter of fun fact, a year ago, Impact Velocity licensed the Compass methodology.
Oh, you did?
Yes, and so we have a 5-year license.
Now. I liked you already. I know I like you even better.
Yeah. We have our version of a 3-day program that Poorani leads. And in fact, today we just finished our 3rd day. We've been working with this family in Vietnam who decided that as part of their 30-year shared future, that people's inner development, planet renewal, and progress sharing was important. And they said, okay, let's get a million people into systems awareness. And so we designed a 3-day program. And we have 1,000 people who have done it in the last 2 years. But that's our vision for Vietnam. And so Saul is part of that journey to create that 30-year shared future.
People aren't watching the visual recording. They should see that I'm doing a deep wide bow to you guys. That's really, really wonderful.
Well, we're standing on your shoulders, all that great work and that you've done, and many, many more. And it's just amazing as we zoom out and hear and see all the great work. That gives us hope that this can be done. We're really so happy that in the occasion of this Soul Conference, bringing together like kind of almost a virtual catch up and reconnection. Because I think to some extent, like what you said, it's kind of gotten into the background, the work that is required to actually develop that mindset, to develop that personal mastery. What does it actually take? Because we don't have time to spend on that inner work or even reflecting what is the best way forward. What does personal mastery mean for you inside of everything you've been through?
A great question. And I think it's a wonderful topic that you've framed this podcast around. I'd also like to say, for those listening to the podcast between Ramesh and Poorani on this topic, which was recorded not long ago, that'll give you a real good basis for starting. I really liked what you had to say about the relationship between individual development, personal mastery, and, waking up to the global issues that we're actually working for. That was a beautiful, beautiful story. So for me, personal mastery, having been orbiting around those concepts through the family of people that I mentioned earlier, for a long time. And I'll even share with you that I realized I should find out what's been going on. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a current update on how personal mastery has been used, criticized, etc. So I did my homework before this.
Oh, thank you.
At some cost to the planet's CO2 budget, but that's another story. So I just have 3 quick things to say about personal mastery. One, I definitely have experienced that it's a lifelong practice. You are never done trying to get a handle on yourself in relation to the work that we're doing. I taught a lot of what we used to call master classes, which seems to me a little bit arrogant that I was teaching master classes before I have totally mastered anything. But one of the things I kept bumping into there, for example, just to pick one example and why the relationship between individual and everything else is so important. A lot of people lift up intuition, and I do too, as an important source of insight. Of course, our brain, my goodness, most of what we think and decide is actually happening unconsciously. And then our neurologists or neurophysiologists tell us that the part that's thinking is really just the PR system for what the rest of the brain is doing. But in any case, sometimes an intuition is a genuine insight. Your brain has processed lots of information in ways that you weren't even aware of and offers it up to you as an aha or a hunch or a feeling, a gut feeling. sometimes it's just a reflex, it's something that your parents used to do this and it made you upset. And so you're upset and now you think it's like the way the world works. And that distinction between a true insight and something that's just a habit of mind from maybe even past trauma is really difficult. And it follows you the rest of your life unless you're maybe a Zen master or something else. So that's the first thing. Buckminster Fuller was one of my old heroes, and people like to quote him as saying, it's all about trial and error, error, error. You just keep trying. Second thing, personal mastery is not just personal. It's about relationships and dyads, groups, communities, and institutions. And I'd love to talk more about that. And then the third, to be super quick, personal mastery, it can bring us a lot of personal fulfillment and a feeling of fulfillment, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes what it means is, and what it requires, is a certain amount of sacrifice. You don't get to personal mastery by just doing what you think you really want deep inside. You get to personal mastery by making some deep accommodations to the needs of the world and your own needs and the needs of the people that you're close to, and having a very clear, as much as you can, given all the challenges we've just talked about, ethical compass to help steer you in that regard. That's my current take on personal mastery. And it's not an encyclopedia and it's not complete, but it's how I orient myself.
That's a lot to unpack. That's a lot, just that itself.
Alan, can you take us through a project that you did that can demonstrate these elements? And how have you seen that in the shifts that people have made towards some kind of systemic change?
I'll tell you a little bit about one of the projects I was most happy to be part of in my role working in the Swedish government. So one thing about being a change person is that you sometimes really want to be the person who has the idea that everybody then thinks is a beautiful idea, right? You get older and you realize, actually, maybe your role is to help other people's ideas get to the fore.
That's right.
And I ended up in a position where it was definitely not my job as a very senior person in this government agency to have a lot of new ideas. My job was to approve and support the ideas that were good. That's a personal mastery issue, because if I can tell you, I've seen a lot, and it's unfortunately, again, more of a male than a female quality, that somebody else's idea suddenly becomes the top guy's idea and no credit is shared. Yeah. All right. So here's what I want to say about this story. And I'm going to send your listeners to something called the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance website. Just Google GISD Alliance. And what you'll find is an extraordinary initiative that was promoted by a lot of really wonderful people, some of them working for me, some of them working in the UN, some of them working in private business, that developed a global network of very top senior people in 30 of the world's most important investment firms to promote the idea of sustainable investment, with the Secretary General of the United Nations as the convener. How did that happen? When I arrived in my job, I saw that some of my colleagues were working on a really important idea, and I said, that's the idea, go, and I'll try to help you. And I used my experience and things to try to pave the way for this idea. But all the work was done by other people. I just watched and nodded and said, hooray. The second thing, it's the mixture of all these personal relationships, building trust between the chief investment officer of company X and UN official A, and they have to get to know each other. They have to trust each other. It's personal, but it's also institutional, and it has to work in institutional terms. That's tricky. And then the thing about fulfillment and sacrifice, sometimes you just got to burn the extra midnight oil. You got to make the extra trip. These were big sacrifices, but in this case, you sometimes just have to put personal interests aside to make something work. And I watched a lot of people in the UN system, in the government systems, in the company systems, just stretch their personal capacities and their personal capital to the limit to get this idea in place. So has it changed the world? Yeah. But has it transformed it utterly and financed all of our sustainability dreams? No. But it has definitely put a huge new sort of edifice in the system. And it's from that combination of people working with passion at the individual level, but negotiating institutionally and community-wise, and making the personal sacrifices required to do it.
How long ago was that?
The launch date was, I think, 2019 officially.
Oh, wow.
And if people go to my website, they'll find my recent keynote speech at an academic conference here in Europe, where I said, 30 years ago, I made this kind of joke in another speech that, if we succeed in our sustainability visions, the result is going to be a bureaucracy. And that is in fact the case. Now we have here in Europe, we have these fantastic laws, and all over the world there are codes and guidelines, and the UN itself, of course, and even scientific publications are themselves bureaucracies. But this GISD alliance is part of that, you might say, global bureaucracy. So it's almost invisible to most people. And most sustainability is invisible and somewhat bureaucratic. So what I love about what you're doing with this podcast, with the conference, and will do for the global community of people who care about these issues, is to bring the bureaucracy and the personal passion back together, because we need that in order for these things to work.
That's such an interesting perspective, because I think it's almost like fulfillment and the personal peace, right? And freedom, right? And somehow bureaucracy and having structures seems a confinement or seems a restriction. How do we reconcile with that?
You went right to the heart of things here, Poorani, with that question. I'll back up a little bit and say that when working with people who want to work on sustainability and system change, et cetera, one of the first pieces of advice I have, or questions I like to pose, is, where do you want to be in the system? Where are you most effectively deployed as a resource? Where are you happiest? And if you're happy being an activist on the front lines with a placard because that's who you are, then do that. But listen, if you have the skill to move into the system, suppress your desire to shout at everybody and work diplomatically to kind of, over the course of a year or 4, move an idea forward, then that's where you should be. And so for me, it's important that we just have clarity about where it is we are in the system. And so I discovered some years ago that while I enjoyed being out in the woods and chanting and staying up all night around a fire, which I sometimes did secretly while I was consulting to the big companies, but I also enjoyed putting on my suit and working with a lot of people in an institutional setting and saying, okay, but we know this is a good idea. We know it's not quite ready for prime time yet, but what can we do to move it forward? How can we polish it off so that it looks, less radical? Those kinds of conversations were always very interesting. If people are able and willing to make that journey, then I also encourage them to do that, because the bureaucracy part of sustainability isn't always the most fun. Sometimes if where you want to be is at the party, then you're a good party person. And I've been in that role too, where you're the facilitator and you're the workshop leader and you're this rock star. That's fun. And maybe that's where you should be. But sometimes we also need people who can put that need aside and move into that quieter, systemic, institutional process. So for me, that was also a kind of an aha. I've been standing on stages and singing songs about sustainability and all kinds of things for years. And I got my middle 50s and said, maybe it's time to do something else. And that's when I moved into a government role. It wasn't just something I could just pick up and do, but I sought my way into that kind of role. That's my story.
Well, I just want to follow up on that piece, right? So it's almost like it's part of the mastery journey in a way, right? That we're not fitting that role, and that's showing up or emerging for us to step into. And the question is first, are we cognizant that that's happening? And then are we ready or willing? I think that's the part of sacrifice you're speaking of, right? That are we ready to let go of the comfort or the known space and to move into the new space that's really calling us now?
Absolutely. I won't name this person, but I saw a dear colleague who had passed away. Not somebody I knew personally, just somebody I admired. And there were pictures of this person over time, a man. In his most recent pictures, he was in his suit, not bald, in fact. But in his early pictures, he was a hippie. He had clearly made this journey that not everybody needs to make that journey. That's not what I'm saying either. I don't think you're saying that. But it is about being very conscious and intentional where you're good and making the adjustments that also happen over time. We change over time, and the times change us.
Exactly. Yeah.
We are fixated with discovering who am I, but then once we discover who am I, then where am I best used? That itself is also another journey. And I guess what you're saying is that if you're truly listening to what's happening around us, we'll be able to see those opportunities and step into it.
Absolutely. And it does require a certain willingness, as you're indicating and hinting, I think, Ramesh, that of the ability to practice a certain kind of quiet introspection. Some people might call it mindfulness or meditation, but certainly using the inner eye and the inner ear. A dear old friend of mine who I wrote a book with, Axel Klimek, he's very much an expert in coaching issues in Germany. And he and I used to do a lot of workshops together. And he had this wonderful exercise for people who weren't comfortable necessarily with meditating or anything like that. So we just said, okay, we're going to sit together. And I'm going to give you a raisin. So we gave them a little raisin. And then he had them eat the raisin. And it took like 10 minutes to eat one raisin in this exercise. But it slowed their mental processes down. And they began to see and hear. And then he could use that as a metaphor to say, that's what we're talking about. Getting more in touch with the subtle things, the way the raisin smells before you put it in your mouth. It's not rocket science, but it is a beautiful metaphor. And this is absolutely essential if you're going to be effective at this work. You have to be able to listen to yourself so that you can do, and here's a phrase I learned from you, Poorani, you can be a charismatic listener to others.
So I want to flip this conversation a little bit to corporates. And
Sure.
if I was looking at it not as an individual, but as an organization with a culture, we often find that successful companies take their processes and systems and they create artifacts around that. And then they stop updating, they stop learning. And then they wonder why things are not working. The rules now have forced people not to be able to think newly and not to take the risk and not to relook at the things that was out of bounds. In your work, how do you see that shift happening?
Oh, gosh. What a lovely question. So I have to think about concrete experience, as you were also nudging me to do before. One note that I have is that we underestimate the extent to which corporations, which we love to hold up as examples of fast-moving entrepreneurship, et cetera, but mostly corporations are bureaucracies. We're back to that word. I mean, you have a very vast, complex system, and you have to manage it, and it has to be predictable, and it's got to be able to speed up and slow down according to signals. It's a huge machine. It's going to naturally tend to resistance because it's designed to be change resistant. It's designed to be accommodating certain kinds of change, but not others. You have to change your sourcing in a particular material flow because there was a drought in area X. And, that kind of change they're really well designed for. But a change like, well, you've got to rethink the entire cotton supply chain. They're not so well designed for that. That requires mindset changes of the kinds we were talking about earlier, as well as many complicated other changes, not least of which financial and financial management. Who's going to pay for this? Where's the money going to come from? All our farmers have to retool. Who's going to do that investing? So that's a background to my simple little point about working with companies, is that it's the same story. You find people inside the organization who understand its complexity, have the sense of personal mastery. They've made choices to be in that system for whatever reasons, and they've also learned to manage themselves in the system and manage the system. Yeah, that's the tricky thing. They've gotten their ego out of the way to the extent that any of us can do that. They've learned how to listen. They've learned how to bring people together. They've learned how to gently propose a new idea and build slow agreement around this new idea and transform systems in the mostly slow incremental way that they usually get changed. Now, you get a pandemic or something once in a while and you have to change suddenly, but most change is slow incremental, maybe even a bit boring. I remember years ago when Otto shone with the U theory, and there was a lot of happy experimenting going on. A group of our colleagues in the Sol universe, this is the story I heard. I have to confirm it with them. They'd done this very high-level workshop with people very near the tops of these organizations, and it included a 24-hour solo period in nature, right, where they had a chance to really deeply reflect. Well, when they came back from all this, a lot of them quit their jobs because I don't really want to be in this system anymore. But I tell that little semi-amusing story because it's also about sticking with it. It's also about being willing to just keep at it. And there we come back to the sort of sometimes personal sacrifice involved in making change happen.
So that's interesting. You are saying that there's something that's necessary or required in our existing systems that we could transition, we could do something.
My current belief is that we can change, and that systems do change. And that what we are unhappy with often is that they usually change incrementally. That's what I was getting. It takes usually big shocks to the system to have them change in some other way. Either a new leader comes in with a wild new idea, or an external crisis occurs. But do they change? Yes. I mean, I've worked many years, for example, with the United Nations system, just to pick one. And particularly with certain departments in the UN Secretariat in New York. And I remember very well that when I first started interacting with them, very few, if any, of the people I met in that system knew how to work with business. They just didn't know. They weren't effective at it. But they changed. The system changed. People changed. The whole system learned. And now there are not Global Compact men forever, and there's PR, there's all kinds of things. But the people I'm thinking about, the systems I'm thinking about, they went from not having much experience with this to having lots of experience, and they could do it. Now, that's a high-level experience that I'm talking about there. I heard a lot of people say the UN can't change, and I watched it personally evolve, gain new competencies, establish new management routines, bring in new people, bring in new ideas. It just happened slowly. It took time for it to happen. You look back 10 or 15 years, and it's not the same thing that it was before. So that's my take on things these days. Yes, systems do change. They just don't change as fast as we want. We change sometimes not as fast as we want. And change is what we also call growth or development.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the fundamental rule or point about systems, right? Delays. There's always these delays. So
we could have jumped over everything I just said and just said delays.
That's one of the things, like we have to be with delays, just as we have to be with unintended consequences.
Sometimes those delays are a decade.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Well, as a consultant, before I changed gears, I developed eventually a rule of thumb. Okay, I meet a client, I say a few things, and then I wait a year. And after a year, they were usually ready to actually start doing stuff. That's not a joke. That was a rule of thumb for me.
That's right.
That's great. That's a wonderful reminder for me too, because I do kind of sometimes talk about, I think it's just easier to start a new company, right? Instead of trying to transform the culture or whatever is going on, right? Because it's a struggle.
I think you're right.
Wonderful.
Oh, well, on that note, shall we segue to a new topic? And that's about what's collective consciousness?
You're not one for small talk, are you, Ramesh?
No small talk now.
Gosh, I'm really enjoying this conversation, but it's challenging. Let's pick two poles of a spectrum on which any answer to that question might fall. At one end of the spectrum is, Wernovsky said, called the noosphere. That is, there's the biosphere for all life, and there's the atmosphere for all air, and then there's some metaphoric, but actually physically real sphere of activity where all the thinking that's going on the planet occurs. That's the noosphere, the sphere of consciousness. By the way, it's not just humans. You know, that's another long topic, but there is lots of science now clearly and firmly establishing that many animals, to levels that we probably were surprised about, have some conscious experience. So collective consciousness is one end of the spectrum. And then we're talking about everything on planet Earth that thinks or feels. Wow. Okay. At the other end of the spectrum is, hey, we're a group of people. We're working really hard together. Got a good facilitator, some common understanding of mindset, and we get to know each other well enough that I can almost finish your sentences because I know enough about how you think. Whereas one person who was one of my mentors for group facilitation told me, you want to get to the point where if somebody who's a key person on the team doesn't show up, everybody else can basically guess what that person would have said. And so that's also a kind of collective consciousness. It's a small collective, but you're sharing a certain conscious space that was not just language either. It's a feeling, it's gestures, it's how you pour tea or coffee for each other, but it's also about certain key concepts like sustainability or delays or systems thinking. Leverage points are really key. So and then there would be an incredible number of answers that would be in between those two extremes for defining collective consciousness, having to do with very large groups of people sharing strong belief systems to smaller groups of people. Nation states are a kind of collective consciousness. In working on these issues, back to the purpose of your podcast and the purpose of our work on systems and sustainability, what we're trying to do when we're doing personal mastery work and systems thinking and sustainability is create bubbles or islands of collective consciousness of some kind. We're all thinking something the same way. We're not doing telepathy, but the way you nod at me when I say leverage point makes me know that I don't have to explain myself. And we're working to find those leverage points. We're sharing information in a trusting, safe atmosphere with each other. That's also collective consciousness, in my experience. Sorry if that went on too long, but actually my only academic degree is in philosophy, so I love talking about this stuff.
Wonderful.
And I love how you have decoded it in the two extremes, right? From especially that even in small teams, we can experience that collective consciousness as we work together, synchronity or supporting each other.
Yes.
And then the other extreme is that more spiritual, whichever way that you want to define it, that whole inquiry of what's this world or whatever that is.
Oh, yeah. And there, if one works internationally, which I know you do, and I've done for many years, one part of personal mastery is cultivating a sense of deep respect for the diversity and difference of the way people even approach a question like collective consciousness, or the way people use or don't use. For some people, that's an essential word to create a feeling together. For other people, that word might trigger something negative. You have to know your group and whether this is a group that is going to have the same feeling about that kind of a word as other people. But I think that general feeling that you were just talking about, Ramesh, that I think everybody can relate to that, where you sense and feel, and it's part of intuition in the way that we're talking about it, a deep commonality of purpose and intention. You can call that spirit, or you can call that collective consciousness, or you can call that great teamwork, depending on where you are.
Great. Wonderful. We're going to jump to fun questions. Is there one belief about personal mastery that you held 10 years ago, let's say, that you no longer believe?
Noting that it's lifelong, I probably believed personally that I was farther along on my own journey of personal mastery than I do today.
How interesting.
If you move into different contexts and you face different kinds of challenges, you learn new things about yourself and you realize, oh, that's something I still have to work on, or I need to polish, or I wasn't even aware was an issue for me. I'll mention to you, because it's on my blog and I published on LinkedIn, I had a stress-related burnout experience not long ago. So I wrote about it publicly on LinkedIn and on my blog, because the key thing about that experience that I really want to share with people was that I had no idea it was coming. I mean, it wasn't like I was very upset and really nervous and suddenly I was feeling, I didn't even feel stressed. The interesting thing was my body was stressed and I wasn't aware of it. From one day to the next, I basically couldn't do very much physically. That was a very humbling wake-up call. Okay, I'm not really as in touch with myself as I thought I was. And also, I was working in circumstances where I literally didn't have time to even pause. I probably could have forced myself to pause, but I didn't believe that I had time to pause and reflect on where I was. So that's something 10 years ago I would not have expected that would happen. At a certain point in my life, I was, for example, running a think tank on sustainable economics, fairly high level in that kind of way, meeting with government officials and senior corporate people. But I was also living in a former Zen monastery at the same time, practicing Zen meditation every morning, but I didn't talk about it. It was one of those things I kept private. And so with all that kind of personal experience in the background, I really thought stress was really not an issue for me. I'd learned how to manage it. If people are interested, you can go to my blog and read about it. It's called The Chronicle of a CEO Burnout. I was the CEO of a intergovernmental organization at the time. I'm open about it because I think it's important for people to have the opportunity to avoid what I experienced.
Thank you for sharing that, Alan. I just read another article with someone sharing in Singapore having a burnout too. And for them too, it was completely unexpected. And I think it's very timely. In fact, we've got Adam Kahane's podcast coming up, and he speaks of one of the everyday habits to self-care for anyone who's taking on transforming system. But thank you so much for sharing that.
I was telling all my staff to practice self-care, but I still...
From what you just shared, right, Alan, what I saw was in the journey of personal mastery, sacrifice, accepting sacrifice and doing that is actually the frame that pushes us to get things done, pushes the way down to stress, right? And for me, it was this neck pain. Luckily, it was a physical body signal, and I just had to stop because I just couldn't do anything more.
I couldn't say that any better. Then we're back to something that I still reflect a lot about, reflecting on how much, when we reflect, we really still aren't necessarily in touch with the totality of what we are, what planet is, what the systems around us are. We maybe have a little bit of hubris about just how deep we can go with reflection itself. It's a much more philosophical topic, but I definitely would like to encourage people, even if you don't feel stressed, to assume that if you're in a stressful situation, you are stressed, and practice self-care in relation to that.
I'm going to ask this next question because it's something that I've had to do a few times through certain crises in my own life. Sometimes we do come to a point where we can lose everything. And it can be a sense of loss of our reputation, loss of our network, or even our success. The question is, how do you rebuild your mastery from scratch? Because there was this whole domain that you had, and then you don't have access to it. Poorani and I were in a situation where we left an organization, and because of a non-compete, that whole domain shut down and we had to relearn. And that was great because we got into systems awareness. But that 5 years was a lonely, exiled journey in the forest. So I think with the kind of change that people are experiencing in life, with the disruption that we see, when jobs are not there anymore and you have to reinvent yourself, how do you do that? Even if it is not to the level of mastery, just to learn, get back.
I do have experience from my personal career path that I can relate to what you're saying, and not the same circumstances, Ramesh. A couple of times, either back in the early 90s, I had to leave a job that I actually quite liked. And not because of anything I'd done, but because the circumstances just made it impossible to stay. So I had to reinvent myself. And I did. And then a couple of times when I was running my business, you build it up, and then, my goodness, my company was on the verge of a real big, explosive level of growth. And then 11 happened in the United States. And a lot of contracts got canceled overnight. I still had the company when it was all over, but I had no clients and no capital, and had to start over again. Even something as really rather pedantic, that's not bureaucratically troubling, as the GDPR law in Europe, which forced me to delete my entire mailing list from my newsletter because it wasn't compliant. When those moments happen, and I think they happen to us in larger or smaller scales, you had a particularly large scale experience yourselves. That's when everything I've been saying about personal mastery not being just personal becomes very important. Because you don't get back to something that you can call a meaningful path of work by yourself. Even if you're a sole contractor, you're flying your flag and you're a consultant, you're not a consultant if you don't have clients. And you don't get clients if you don't have friends. And you don't have friends if you're not trustworthy. And you're not trustworthy if you don't know yourself. I mean, all of this kind of leads back to the more fundamental aspects of personal mastery that we're talking about.
How time has flown, right? Thank you so much.
Yeah, you kept me going. This was an unexpectedly fun conversation. I thought it was going to be a pleasant one, but not a fun one. But thank you so much for having me, and I hope able to say something cogent along the way. I'm sure your editing will help make it even better.
You said a lot of wonderful things.
I think it's so apt and so needed. And I'm sure all our listeners will really find great value. And we're looking forward to having you at the, virtually, but nonetheless, very valuable time at the conference and addressing us.
Oh, gosh, I'm so looking forward to it. Thanks so much.